Victoria Walsh stood outside the metal door marked with the Monster Division insignia, a red circle with a black serpent coiled inside it. She checked her transfer orders again, reading the same words she had read 3 times already that morning. The orders were clear. Reassignment effective immediately. Captain Victoria Walsh to Monster Division, Combat Unit 7. She had been working in the Supply Coordination Office for 15 years. 15 years of managing inventory lists, tracking shipment schedules, and making sure that soldiers across the entire interspecies alliance had the equipment they needed to survive. Her record was clean. She had never missed a deadline. She had never lost a single supply package. She had earned 3 commendations for efficiency. And now, someone in the main office had decided to move her to a place where she had no business being. The door slid open without her knocking. A tall man in a dark blue uniform stood in the doorway. His face was weathered and scarred. His left eye had a thin white line running across it. This was Commander Gregory Hayes, and Victoria knew from the files that he had been running the Monster Division for 8 years. He had lost more soldiers than any other commander in the Alliance military. "You are lost," Hayes said, looking at her uniform. It was not a question. "Captain Victoria Walsh," she said, holding out her transfer orders. "I have been assigned to your unit." Hayes took the papers and read them slowly. His expression did not change, but his jaw tightened. He handed the papers back to her. "This is a mistake," he said. "The orders came from Colonel Bennett's office," Victoria replied. "They say, I know what they say. Come in." The division headquarters was nothing like the supply office. The walls were bare, except for maps showing different regions of known space. Soldiers moved quickly between rooms. She could hear weapons being checked and cleaned. Everything had a feeling of controlled urgency. Like people preparing for something dangerous. Hayes led her to a table where 3 other soldiers were studying a large display showing data about a distant sector. He introduced them without stopping to let them react to her presence. "This is Captain Walsh. She has been assigned to us by mistake. She will be observing for now." He said nothing else and walked away. The 3 soldiers turned to look at her, with expressions that ranged from confusion to suspicion. The first was Sergeant Marcus Quinn, a muscular man with short dark hair and cold eyes. The second was Lieutenant David Patterson, younger, with a sharp face and sharper attitude. The third was Officer Sarah Mills, a woman with gray streaks in her black hair and the hardened look of someone who had seen real combat. "What was your previous position?" Mills asked, not unkindly. "Supply coordination," Victoria said. "Inventory management." Patterson made a quiet, laughing sound. "They sent us a pencil pusher." "Inventory is important," Victoria said, keeping her voice steady. "Equipment saves lives." "Equipment does not matter if the person holding it is dead," Quinn said. He turned back to the display without waiting for a response. Victoria felt heat rise in her face, but she said nothing. She had learned long ago that arguing never helped. People had opinions about what jobs were important and what jobs were not. She could not change their minds by talking. Over the next 3 days, Victoria tried to understand what the Monster Division actually did. She attended briefings. She read mission reports. She studied the records of alien species that the division had encountered. The work was darker and more violent than anything in her previous experience. These soldiers did not manage supply lines. They fought creatures that were faster, stronger, and more deadly than humans. The wrecks were the current focus of everyone's attention. The division had been tracking their movements for 6 months. Something about their behavior had changed. They had started attacking Alliance outposts in the Kepler sector. They were gathering ships. They were preparing for something large. On the morning of the 4th day, Hayes called a full briefing. Victoria sat in the back of the room while he explained the mission. The monster division was being deployed to the Kepler sector immediately. They would investigate the Rex activity and determine the threat level. If necessary, they would engage. "We leave in 6 hours," Hayes said. "Everyone checks their weapons and gear. I want no surprises once we get there." The soldiers began moving around Victoria, checking equipment, reviewing data, preparing themselves mentally for what might be coming. She stood alone in the middle of the activity, watching them. She realized with a sinking feeling that she would be going with them. Her transfer orders had not been overturned. She was part of this unit now, whether she belonged or not. Quinn walked past her toward the weapons storage. He stopped and looked back at her. "You should go back to your office," he said. "Tell them you are sick. Transfer yourself out before we deploy. This place is not for people like you." Victoria did not know what to say. Part of her wanted to agree with him. Another part of her wanted to prove that she could do this job, whatever it was. In the end, she did the only thing she knew how to do. She nodded to Quinn and walked to the equipment station to prepare her gear for deployment. The transport ship left the Alliance station 6 hours later. Victoria sat in a military-grade chair with a safety harness, watching the planet below grow smaller as they climbed toward space. Around her, the soldiers of Monster Division Unit 7 prepared for combat. They cleaned weapons that were already clean. They reviewed mission data they had already memorized. They dealt with the tension in their own ways. Victoria watched and said nothing. She understood now why Hayes had called her presence a mistake. She did not have the training these people had. She did not have the experience. She was supposed to order supplies, not fight alien creatures, but the orders had been given and she would follow them. She had always followed orders. That was what she did. That was who she was taught as the ship jumped into faster-than-light travel and the stars blurred outside the window. Victoria closed her eyes and wondered how long she could survive in a place where she did not belong. The Kepler sector looked empty from space. Victoria stared at the scanner displays as the transport ship moved closer to their destination. Stars scattered across the black void. A few planets orbiting distant suns. Nothing that looked dangerous. Nothing that looked alive. "There," one of the sensor operators said, pointing at the screen. "Massive structure at coordinates 47-19. The structure appeared slowly as they approached. It was not a ship. Victoria understood that immediately. It was something else entirely. The object was a sphere, but not a simple sphere. Geometric patterns covered its surface. Lights moved across these patterns in regular logical sequences. It was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. Hayes studied the readings from the bridge. "Size estimate? Roughly 300 kilometers in diameter," the operator replied. "Readings suggest artificial construction. Very old. Possibly thousands of years old. What about weapons? No active weapon signatures detected. Life signs are minimal. The structure appears mostly dormant." Victoria found herself leaning forward. She had never seen anything like this before. The patterns on the surface followed mathematical rules. They were not random. Someone had built this thing with purpose. Someone had spent enormous time and resources creating something this massive, a small shuttle, launched from the transport with 6 soldiers, including Commander Hayes. Victoria was ordered to remain on the main ship. She watched on the monitor as the shuttle approached the massive structure. A panel opened on its surface, revealing an interior space that glowed with blue light. The shuttle entered. For 10 minutes, nothing happened. Then the communication system crackled with Hayes' voice. "We are inside. There is a control chamber. The structure is some kind of database or classification system." He paused. There were sounds in the background that Victoria could not identify. The symbols match nothing in our database, but there are sections that reference known species. I see the Vrex. I see the communication cut off abruptly. Shuttle 1, respond. The radio operator called. Shuttle 1, this is command. Nothing but static answered. Then alarms began sounding on the main ship. The sensor operator was shouting about incoming contacts. Multiple ships appearing on the scanner from different directions simultaneously. The Vrex had been waiting. All personnel to combat stations. The radio crackled with an officer's voice. This is not a drill. All personnel to combat stations. Victoria moved with the other crew members toward the reinforced sections of the ship designed for combat. Her heart was beating hard. She had never heard weapons fire in person before. She had never felt the shock of a vessel being struck by enemy fire. The first impact made her stumble. Emergency lights flooded the corridors with red glow. People were running now, moving with purpose toward defensive positions. Victoria found herself in the weapons control room, watching the tactical display as Vrex ships closed in on their position. She could see the shuttle was still on the monitor, still inside the massive structure. She could see the Vrex were surrounding them, cutting off any possibility of escape. In the weapons control room, the tactical officer was trying to coordinate a defense with limited resources. They had one ship against multiple Vrex vessels. The mathematics were clear. They were going to lose. Victoria watched the display and saw something strange. The Vrex were moving in patterns. Not random patterns. Coordinated patterns that seemed to follow mathematical rules. They moved in formations, attacked from predictable angles, pulled back to regroup at regular intervals. The Vrex are following a tactical pattern, Victoria said quietly. Nobody responded. Everyone was focused on defense. They are following a pattern, Victoria said louder. If they follow a pattern, then they are predictable. If they are predictable, then we can calculate their next move. The tactical officer finally looked at her. His expression showed that he thought she was crazy, but he was desperate, and desperate people listened to strange ideas. Show me, he said. Victoria moved closer to the display. Using the last 30 seconds of Vrex movement, she identified the pattern. Every 3 attacks, they pulled back to the same formation. Every 4 formations, they shifted position in a specific way. The pattern repeated in cycles. Here, she said, pointing at the tactical map. They will attack from this angle next. But they must be vulnerable here during their regrouping. If we concentrate fire here, we can damage their formation. Force them to break pattern. The tactical officer was desperate enough to try. He adjusted the defensive fire pattern. When the Vrex made their next attack, the human defenses were waiting in exactly the right place. The Vrex attack suffered heavy damage. One of their ships exploded. The others pulled back further than expected, trying to recalculate their approach. Again, Victoria said, watching the pattern shift. They are adjusting. The new pattern is slower. It gives us more time. If we move the shield generators now, we can have them in position when they attack the left side. The tactical officer listened this time. He moved the resources. The Vrex attacked again. The human defenses held stronger. The battle continued this way for another 20 minutes. Victoria called out positions based on what she saw in the patterns. The tactical officer moved resources. The Vrex found themselves fighting against an opponent that seemed to know exactly where they would strike. Then Hayes's voice came through the communication system again. It was broken and filled with static, but the words were clear. We have the data. The structure is a universal classification system. It rates every known species by threat level. We are marked as Class E. Minimal threat. The Vrex are Class A. Apex predators. We need to get out of here. Now. The shuttle launched from the massive sphere and burned toward their ship at maximum speed. The Vrex seemed to realize that they were about to lose their chance. They launched one final massive coordinated attack. Victoria watched the patterns and understood what was happening. This was not a standard attack. This was their maximum effort. Everything calculated to overload the human defenses. She looked at the display and saw the solution. It was there in the patterns. The Vrex were so committed to their calculated attack that they had left a gap. A moment when they would be vulnerable. A moment that would last only seconds. Move everything to the center, Victoria said. All defenses concentrate on the center. When they attack, we break through here. The tactical officer hesitated only a moment. He gave the order. The Vrex attacked with all their strength. The human defenses concentrated at exactly the right point. The Vrex formation shattered. Their attack fell apart. The shuttle docked with the main ship. Hayes ran to the communication station. "Get us out of here," he ordered. Full speed to the jump gate. The transport ship burned its engines hard, pulling away from the Vrex vessels. The aliens pursued briefly, but the damage from the battle had slowed them down. The human ship reached the jump gate and activated the faster-than-light drive. Space twisted. The Kepler sector disappeared behind them. Hayes walked into the weapons control room. He looked at Victoria standing near the tactical display. His scarred face showed no emotion. "Captain," he said, "explain what you just did." Victoria took a breath before answering. She had just helped save them all. She had found a way to fight an enemy that was stronger and faster. She had done it by seeing something everyone else had missed. "The Vrex think in patterns," she said. "They are logical. They optimize everything. That means they are predictable. If they are predictable, we can calculate what they will do. And if we know what they will do, we can be ready for it." Hayes nodded slowly. "Good," he said. "You just earned your place on this ship." The transport ship was damaged but still functioning. Communications were limited. They were stranded in space between jump gates with the Vrex still hunting them. The situation was not good. Everyone understood that. Hayes called a full strategic meeting with his senior staff, and this time, Victoria was included. She sat at the table with the other officers. Sergeant Quinn was there, along with Patterson and Mills, officers and soldiers who had spent their entire careers studying combat tactics and military strategy. And now they were listening to a supply officer explain how to survive against an enemy that was stronger and faster than they were. Victoria spread out her data across the table. She had spent the last 4 hours analyzing everything about the Vrex, their attack patterns, their defensive formations, their response times, the way they managed their resources. She had taken all of this information and created a detailed profile of how they thought. "The Vrex are not like us," Victoria said, pointing at the data. "They operate on pure logic. Every decision they make is calculated to be efficient. Every move they make follows from a mathematical framework. This makes them incredibly powerful. But it also makes them predictable." "We already know they follow patterns," Patterson said. His tone suggested he was not interested in hearing a basic review. "The question is how that helps us survive. They still have more ships. They still have better weapons." Victoria nodded. She had expected this kind of skepticism. These soldiers had been trained to think in terms of firepower and tactical advantage. She was asking them to think differently. "Imagine a mathematical equation," Victoria said. "The Vrex are the equation. We are the variables. If they are trying to solve for us, they will follow a specific process. They will input information, calculate the best response, and execute that response. But what happens if we change the variables? What happens if we introduce data they did not expect?" Quinn leaned forward. Unlike Patterson, he was actually thinking about what she was saying. "You want to confuse them," Quinn said. More than that, Victoria replied. I want to make their calculations worthless. I want to introduce chaos into their system. Their view system. Humans are good at chaos. We can act on incomplete information. We can make intuitive leaps that are not based on pure logic. The Vrex cannot do this. If we can force them into situations where logic fails, then we can win. She showed them her plan. It was complex, but elegant. First, they would use their remaining power to create false sensor signals. The Vrex would detect phantom ship locations and phantom weapon signatures. The Vrex would calculate that there were more human ships than actually existed. This would force them to spread their forces thinner. Second, Victoria proposed they use their limited resources in ways that made no logical sense. They would create power surges that suggested weapon charging but discharged nothing. They would move their ship in ways that appeared damaged but were actually tactical repositioning. They would broadcast communications designed to sound like they were calling for reinforcements that were not coming. Third, and most importantly, they would use timing and unpredictable actions. When the Vrex expected them to hide, they would attack. When the Vrex expected them to attack, they would retreat. Each action would be the opposite of what logical calculation would suggest. This will force their systems to recalculate constantly, Victoria explained. Every time they update their calculations, the situation will have changed again. Eventually, their calculations will fall behind reality. They will be fighting a battle based on outdated information. Mills studied the plan for a long time before speaking. She had more combat experience than anyone else in the room. This could work, Mills said slowly. But it requires everyone to think differently. We cannot fall back on standard tactics. We have to be willing to do things that seem wrong. That is exactly right, Victoria said. We have to think like we are the ones who do not understand war. We have to think like we have nothing to lose. Because right now, from the Vrex perspective, that is true. They believe they are superior. They believe we are classy threats. We need to make them question those calculations. Hayes listened to everything. He did not interrupt. He did not question. When Victoria finished, he stood up. Captain Walsh will be in charge of tactical operations, he said. Everyone will follow her strategic directions. Is this understood? Patterson started to object. Hayes cut him off with a look. This woman just saved all of our lives once, Hayes said flatly. We are going to trust her again. Over the next 18 hours, Victoria's plan was put into action. The monster division did not think or act like a standard military unit anymore. They acted like desperate people improvising survival. They did things that appeared foolish until the Vrex response made it clear that those actions had worked. Victoria coordinated everything from the tactical center. She gave orders that seemed to contradict each other. Move left, then immediately move right. Fire weapons, but aim to miss. Create loud signals, but transmit them on frequencies the Vrex would ignore. Every action was designed to introduce chaos into the enemy's calculations. The Vrex response was confusion. Their ships would move toward false targets. They would prepare for attacks that never came. They would adjust their formations based on information that was no longer accurate. For the first time in this battle, the human ships seemed to have an advantage. Quinn worked directly with Victoria now, executing her orders without question. When she said to create a specific power surge, he did it. When she said to move the ship in a seemingly damaged pattern, he followed the command. He had started as skeptical as Patterson, but he had seen the results. Why do you see things the rest of us do not? He asked her during a brief pause in the operation. Victoria considered the question. It was not about being smarter or having better training. It was about thinking differently. I was taught to organize systems, Victoria said. To manage inventory. To track where resources go and where they come from. The wrecks are a system. They have inputs and outputs. They have rules for how resources are used. Once I understood that, I could see the patterns in how they think. I am just doing what I always did. I am just managing the system differently. 18 hours became 24 hours. The wrecked ships were still pursuing, but they were no longer coordinating effectively. The chaos Victoria had introduced had broken their unified command structure. They were operating as individual units instead of as a single organism. And then the transport ship reached the jump gate. Hayes gave the order to activate the faster-than-light drive. The ship twisted through space, jumping to a new location light years away. The wrecks were left behind, confused and separated. They had survived. When everything was finally secure, Hayes called Victoria to his private office. He closed the door behind her. "You were never meant to be in supply coordination," he said. This was not a question. "No," Victoria admitted. "I was not." "Then why did you accept that assignment?" Victoria had thought about this many times. The answer was complicated, but she tried to explain it. "I followed orders," she said. "I did the job I was given. I became very good at it because I always complete what I start. But part of me always wondered if I could do something more challenging." Hayes nodded. He walked to a window showing the stars outside his office. "You are not leaving this unit," he said. "That is not a suggestion. That is an order from your commander. You will remain with the Monster Division. You will train new soldiers in your methods. You will help us understand that victory does not always come from strength. Sometimes it comes from thinking clearly when everything else is falling apart." Victoria felt something shift inside her. She had spent 15 years organizing supplies. For the last 2 days, she had organized people and strategies. She had used her mind in ways she had never used it before. She had discovered who she could become if given the chance. "Yes, sir," she said. "Thank you, sir." Hayes looked at her with respect that had not been there before. "You earned it," he said. Communications were restored 3 days after they jumped away from the Kepler sector. The transport ship was able to send and receive messages again. The Alliance Command received Victoria's complete report on the wrecks, the massive classification structure, and the human strategies that had saved the Monster Division. The response from Alliance Command came within hours. It was not the message Victoria expected. An investigator named Colonel James Morrison was being sent to the transport ship. The message said there would be a full inquiry into Victoria's assignment to the Monster Division. There was mention of procedural violations and potential misconduct by senior staff. Victoria was ordered to cooperate completely with the investigation. She had no idea what was happening. Colonel Morrison arrived 3 days later on a shuttle from the Alliance station. He was an older man with gray hair and a careful way of moving that suggested he had been doing this kind of work for a long time. He requested private meetings with each senior officer. Victoria was the last one. They sat in an empty conference room. Morrison opened a file and laid photographs and documents across the table. "Do you recognize this man?" he asked, showing her a picture of Colonel Lawrence Bennett. He was the officer who had signed her transfer orders. "He works in personnel assignment," Victoria said. "I have never met him in person." "Correct," Morrison said. "But he has been keeping a very close record of your work. Starting 3 years ago, he compiled extensive files of your reports and recommendations. Specifically, your warnings about the alien classification system that we found in the Kepler sector." Victoria felt confused. She had made those reports. They had been ignored. She had continued doing her job despite the dismissal. "Your reports were extremely detailed," Morrison continued, pulling out several documents that Victoria recognized as her own work. "You predicted the exact location of the classification system. You predicted that multiple species would use it to identify threats. You recommended that the Alliance prepare defenses against species that the system classified as apex predators. Your warnings were remarkably accurate. Yes, Victoria said slowly. But Alliance Command did not believe me. They said I was being alarmist. They said the data was not sufficient to warrant a major response. Morrison nodded and pulled out more documents. These were internal communications between Alliance Command and Colonel Bennett. Alliance Command did not want to believe you, Morrison said. There were political reasons. Acknowledging your warnings would have required expensive military preparations. It would have required admitting that species we thought we had peaceful relations with might actually be threats. Alliance Command wanted to avoid that conversation. Victoria began to understand. This was going to be about politics and money and power. So Colonel Bennett, Morrison continued, decided to silence you. He requested your reassignment to an active combat unit. The reasoning was that you had become too focused on theory and needed practical military experience. The paperwork looked completely normal. Your assignment to the Monster Division was processed as a routine transfer. It was not routine, Victoria said. It was deliberate. Exactly, Morrison said. Bennett assumed you would either get killed in combat, making your warnings no longer relevant, or you would be too busy with military work to continue making reports that leadership did not want to hear. Either way, your voice would be silenced. Victoria felt anger rise inside her. She had been treated like a threat to be eliminated. She had been sent to die because she knew something that made powerful people uncomfortable. But something unexpected happened, Morrison continued. You survived. And more than that, you discovered the exact thing that everyone feared. You proved that you were right all along. And when faced with the actual threat, you proved that your way of thinking about problems could save lives. Morrison closed the file and leaned back in his chair. Colonel Bennett has been arrested and removed from command, Morrison said. Alliance Command has been made to understand that ignoring legitimate warnings, because they are politically inconvenient, can result in the deaths of soldiers. Your reports are being reviewed by every major department. Your theories about the Vrex and the classification system are being implemented across the entire military. Victoria did not feel happy about this. She had not wanted any of this to happen. She had just wanted her warnings to be taken seriously. There is something else, Morrison said. You have been offered a promotion. You will be made a major in the Alliance military. You can return to the Supply Coordination Office with full authority to implement your security recommendations. You can also choose to remain with the Monster Division. Either option is available to you. He stood up and left her alone in the conference room with the choice in front of her. Victoria sat for a long time, thinking about what she wanted. The Supply Coordination Office was familiar. It was safe. She would have authority now. She could make changes based on what she had learned. She could go back to the life she had known before all of this started, but she also knew what she had become in the last few days. She had discovered that she could think in ways that saved lives. She had discovered that her methods could work in situations where traditional military thinking failed. She had discovered that she mattered. When she left the conference room, she went directly to Hayes' office. I want to stay, she said. Hayes looked up from his desk. He seemed unsurprised by her decision. I thought you might say that, he said. There is work to do. Real work. Victoria spent the next month designing a new training program for the Monster Division. The program combined traditional military training with problem-solving strategies. She brought in soldiers from different backgrounds. Soldiers who thought differently. Soldiers who asked questions. Soldiers who did not just follow standard doctrine. She also began taking soldiers from other species. The Vrex had been using logical systems to evaluate threat levels. Victoria wanted to show that intelligence and creativity existed across all species. She wanted to build a unit where different ways of thinking were valued. Quinn worked with her on the logistics side of the training. Patterson, who had been skeptical from the start, began to understand that the new approach was working. Mills became one of her key instructors. 6 months after the mission in the Kepler sector, the Monster Division had been completely redesigned. They were still warriors, but they were also something more. They were thinkers. They were problem solvers. They were humans and aliens working together. Alliance Command took notice. Other military units requested to adopt her training methods. Victoria was promoted to major officially and given authority to develop new tactical doctrines across the entire military. But she remained with the Monster Division as her primary assignment. She had found her place. One evening, she was reviewing training data when Hayes walked into her office. He had a message for her from Alliance Command. A new threat had been detected in a distant sector. The location was unknown. The threat level was uncertain. They needed Victoria's unit to investigate. Hayes placed the message on her desk and smiled. "You were born for this kind of work," he said. "Not logistics. Not administration. This. Finding solutions when solutions do not seem possible." Victoria picked up the message and began reading. She thought about the girl she had been 3 months ago, sitting in a supply office organizing inventory lists. She thought about how much had changed. She thought about how much more would change. "When do we deploy?" she asked. "Tomorrow," Hayes said. "Get some rest." Victoria nodded, but she knew she would not rest. She was already thinking about the new threat, already analyzing what they might face, already solving the problem in her mind before they even arrived. This was who she was now, and she was exactly where she belonged. 2 years had passed since Victoria Walsh was assigned to the Monster Division by mistake. The training compound was now known across the entire Alliance as the best facility for developing tactical officers. Soldiers from every human colony and from 5 different alien species trained here. They came to learn the Victoria Walsh method, as it had come to be called. But Victoria herself had never liked that name. She called it something else. She called it human thinking. Victoria stood on an observation platform overlooking the training grounds. Below her, 20 soldiers worked together on a scenario. They had limited resources. They had an enemy with superior strength. They had to find a solution using only their intelligence and creativity. The scenario was deliberately unfair. Victoria designed all the training scenarios to be unfair. The point was not to win with numbers or power. The point was to win with thinking. A human captain named Gregory Foster was leading the team. He was new to the advanced course. He had been recommended by his previous commander because he could see problems from unexpected angles. Next to him was a Zydian officer named Kesh. Zydians were crystalline beings, very logical. The military had assumed they would fail in Victoria's program because they thought too much like the Vrex, but Kesh had surprised everyone. Zydians could be logical while still being creative. They could follow rules while breaking them at the same time. Victoria had learned to appreciate their way of thinking. The scenario required them to disable an enemy installation without being detected. Standard tactics said it was impossible. The installation had sensors covering every approach. It had defense systems that would activate automatically. It had more firepower than the team could possibly match. Victoria watched as Foster and Kesh discussed options. They were not discussing how to attack. They were discussing how the installation would think. What would it expect? What patterns would it look for? What assumptions would it make about human and alien behavior? Kesh suggested something interesting. The installation was programmed to detect moving targets. All of their tactics involved some kind of movement. What if they did the opposite? What if they moved slowly? So slowly that the sensors would not register them as threats, but as natural environmental drift? Foster added to the idea. They could use the installation's own power grid against it. If they could trick the power system into overloading, it would shut itself down temporarily. That would open a window to get inside. But how to trick a power system that had no way to think outside of its programming? Cash made a connection. If the power system receives simultaneous demand from multiple locations, it would try to satisfy all demands at once. If they could overload the demand system with false requests, the system would eventually fail trying to meet impossible requirements. But the false requests had to come from inside the installation's own network. They had to appear to be legitimate signals. Victoria smiled. Foster suddenly understood. He explained it to the team. They needed to send something into the installation first. Something small. Something that would not trigger the sensors. Something that could access the power system network without being detected. One team member, a young human female named Monica Price, had an idea. They could use the facility's own maintenance drones. Every installation had automated systems for routine repairs. If they could intercept the signal that controlled those drones, they could repurpose them. It took 30 minutes. They found an old maintenance access point that the installation had forgotten about. They hijacked the signal and reprogrammed the maintenance drones. The drones moved through the facility's networks, sending false power requests. The power system became confused. It tried to route power to places that did not exist. It tried to activate systems that were not real. It overloaded. The installation's power died. The sensors went dark. The defenses deactivated. Foster and his team moved in and completed the objective. Victoria recorded the time and sent it to her data system. Foster's team had done it in 47 minutes. The record was 42 minutes. They were getting better. When the exercise ended, Victoria called the team for a debrief. They gathered in a conference room, still excited from their success. "You did well," Victoria said. "But you were inefficient. You spent too much time discussing and not enough time acting. Next time, make decisions faster." "But we need to understand the problem before we solve it," Monica said. "Correct," Victoria replied. "But understanding does not always require extensive discussion. Sometimes the problem tells you what to do. You just have to listen." Foster asked a question that showed he was thinking at the right level. "Are we learning your way of thinking, or are we learning how to think for ourselves?" Victoria smiled. This was exactly the right question. "There is no such thing as my way of thinking," she said. "What you are learning is how to recognize patterns, how to find the assumptions that your enemy makes, how to turn those assumptions against them. Different species will do this differently. Different situations will require different solutions. What matters is that you learn to think at all. Most soldiers are taught what to do. You are learning how to figure out what to do when no one has told you." The team was dismissed. They left talking excitedly about the exercise. Kesh stayed behind for a moment. "Victoria," he said, using her first name in the way the senior aliens did, "I wanted to inform you. My species is preparing a delegation to the human planets. We want to learn more about human creativity. Our government believes it is a resource we have failed to develop. Many Xidians are interested in your training methods." Victoria was surprised by this. The Xidians had always seemed completely satisfied with their logical systems. "Creativity is not something you learn from a book," Victoria said. "It comes from being willing to fail." "Are your people willing to fail?" "That is exactly what we need to learn," Kesh replied. "How to fail and then continue trying. This is something Xidians have never done well. But we have seen what humans accomplish. We want this for ourselves." After Kesh left, Victoria stood alone in the conference room. She thought about how much the galaxy had changed in the last 2 years. Humans had stopped being seen as weak or irrelevant. Humans had proven that their advantages went beyond physical strength or advanced technology. Humans were good at thinking their way out of problems. Humans were good at doing the unexpected. Humans were good at being creative when situations became desperate. And other species were starting to understand that these traits were as valuable as weapons or power. Victoria walked through the training compound toward her office. She passed soldiers from 6 different species working together on various exercises. She saw Azyvians, Keelians, and humans laughing together after a training session. She saw aliens learning from humans how to think differently. This was the legacy she was building. Not military dominance. Not superior firepower. Something better. She was teaching the galaxy that intelligence came in many forms, and that cooperation between different kinds of intelligence made everyone stronger. When she reached her office, she found Hayes waiting for her. He had retired as commander of the Monster Division and now worked in Alliance Command as a strategic advisor. He was the one who had recommended Victoria for her expanded role developing training doctrines. "How are the new Zydian trainees doing?" he asked. "Better than expected," Victoria said. "They learn quickly, but they still struggle with the idea of taking risks without calculating every possible outcome." "That is something you cannot teach them," Hayes said. "That has to come from experience. From failing and learning that failure does not mean death." Hayes had a message for her from Alliance Command. Another threat had been detected. This one was in a sector they had never explored. The threat was completely unknown. Nobody could predict what they would face. Victoria took the message and read it carefully. "When do we deploy?" she asked. "In 1 week," Hayes said. "And you are going to take them with you." He gestured toward the window. Below, on the training grounds, the newest graduates were preparing for their first real mission. They were younger soldiers, both human and alien. They were the first complete class trained entirely in Victoria's method. They had learned from the beginning that they should think creatively. They had never been taught that there was only one way to solve a problem. Victoria smiled. This would be good. The transport ship left the Alliance station 7 days later. Victoria stood on the bridge watching the stars as they prepared to jump to the unknown sector. The new soldiers were nervous but ready. They had been trained for this moment. They understood that the challenge would be severe. They understood that they would have to think their way to victory. But they also understood something else. They understood that the most dangerous weapon in the galaxy was not a weapon at all. It was a mind that asked questions. It was a person willing to see problems from angles that no one else had considered. It was a human being capable of doing the impossible. And now the galaxy knew it too. Victoria had come to the Monster Division as a mistake. She had been a supply officer who did not belong in a combat unit. But she had survived. She had learned. She had discovered who she could become when given the chance to think beyond the limitations others placed on her. And in doing so, she had changed the way